Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely mind-blowing story of the only African empire that looked European colonizers dead in the eye and said, "Thanks, but we're good." And I'm talking about Ethiopia, who spent over 3,000 years building one of the most legendary civilizations on Earth, while everyone else was getting carved up like a colonial birthday cake. We're covering the complete history of the people who literally never bowed to anyone. And trust me, this makes every other independent story look like amateur hour. So smash that like button if you're ready to learn about the folks who gave the world coffee and then used the caffeine boost to defeat entire Italian armies with spears and determination. Hit subscribe for more ancient civilizations that built churches by carving them straight down into solid rock while claiming their emperor was descended from King Solomon himself. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now settle in, because we're exploring how a highland kingdom in the Horn of Africa became the stuff of legends, created trading networks that stretched from Rome to India, while building stone obelisks that would make modern engineers reach for their calculators, developed a unique form of Christianity so distinctive that European missionaries took one look and said, "What exactly is happening here?" Maintained their independence through sheer stubborn brilliance for over 3 millennia, invented their own calendar system, because apparently the regular one wasn't Ethiopian enough, and somehow managed to be the birthplace of both humanity's oldest fossils and its most resilient empire. All while dealing with invasions, famines, and the occasional need to remind the world that Ethiopia stretches her hands unto God, not colonial powers. In the highlands of Africa, where the morning mist dances with ancient secrets and the coffee beans first whispered their aromatic promises to humanity, there lived a civilization so old that it remembered when the world was young. This is the story of Ethiopia, a land that never bowed, never bent, and somehow managed to keep its independence while the rest of Africa was being carved up like a particularly contentious birthday cake at a colonial dinner party. Our tale begins not with the clash of swords or the thunder of war drums, but with the gentle lapping of waves against a distant shore, and a queen whose beauty was said to rival the very stars themselves. But before we meet this legendary queen, let us pause for a moment and imagine ourselves sitting by a crackling fire, perhaps with a cup of that very coffee that Ethiopia gave to the world, and prepare to embark on a journey through time that spans over 3 millennia. The story of Ethiopia is like a river that has flowed for thousands of years, sometimes rushing through dramatic gorges, sometimes meandering peacefully through fertile valleys, but always moving forward. It is a story of kingdoms that rose and fell like the sun over the Simien Mountains, of emperors who claimed descent from King Solomon himself, and of a people who looked at the mighty colonial powers of Europe and essentially said, "Thanks, but we're good." Long, long ago, when the pyramids of Egypt were still considered newfangled architecture, and Rome was just a twinkle in a wolf's eye, the land that would become Ethiopia was already bustling with activity. The ancient kingdom of Dimpt, which sounds like someone sneezing, but was actually quite sophisticated, flourished in the northern highlands around the 8th century BCE. These early Ethiopians were already showing signs of the stubborn independence that would characterize their descendants. They developed their own writing system, built impressive stone monuments, and probably looked at their neighbors and thought, "We can do this whole civilization thing ourselves. Thank you very much." But it was the kingdom of Axum that truly put Ethiopia on the ancient world's map, and what a spectacular entrance it made. Rising around the 1st century CE, Aksum became one of the great trading powers of the ancient world, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and China. The Aksumites were the kind of people who looked at the Red Sea and saw not a barrier, but a highway to riches. They built a maritime empire that stretched across the Red Sea to Yemen, and their merchants became as familiar a sight in the ports of India and Sri Lanka as monsoon rains. The capital city of Axum was a marvel that would have made ancient urban planners weep with envy. Towering obelisks reached toward the sky like stone fingers, pointing to heaven, some standing over 100 feet tall and carved from single pieces of granite. These weren't just monuments to ego, though there was probably some of that too. They were markers of royal tombs and symbols of a kingdom's power. The largest of these obelisks, had it been successfully erected, would have been taller than any structure built in the ancient world. Unfortunately, it fell during construction, which must have been the ancient equivalent of a very expensive and very public construction fail. One can imagine the Aksumite king standing there, looking at the fallen obelisk and muttering something that roughly translates to, "Well, that's not going on my LinkedIn profile." The Axumites were also early adopters of Christianity, converting in the 4th century CE under King Ezana, making Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in the world. This wasn't just a political decision. It was a transformation that would shape Ethiopian identity for millennia to come. The story goes that a young Syrian Christian named Frumentius was shipwrecked on the Ethiopian coast, eventually became tutor to the royal princes, and gradually introduced Christianity to the court. It's a classic tale of how sometimes the most profound changes come not through conquest or coercion, but through the quiet influence of a dedicated teacher. Frumentius later became the first bishop of Ethiopia, and probably never imagined that his influence would still be felt over 1,600 years later. But let's return to that queen we mentioned earlier, for no story of ancient Ethiopia would be complete without the legendary Queen of Sheba. Now, historians will tell you that the Queen of Sheba might have been from Yemen, or perhaps she was a composite of several different rulers, or maybe she was entirely mythical. But the Ethiopians have never let a little thing like historical uncertainty get in the way of a good story. And they claim her as their own, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that possession is 9/10 of the law, even in ancient history. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba, known locally as Queen Makeda, heard tales of King Solomon's wisdom and decided to pay him a visit. This wasn't just any royal visit. This was the ancient equivalent of a summit meeting between two superpowers. The queen arrived in Jerusalem with a caravan so laden with gold, spices, and precious stones that it probably caused the world's first recorded traffic jam. Solomon, not to be outdone, welcomed her with such magnificence that their meeting became the stuff of legend. The Ethiopian version of events gets particularly interesting here. According to the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, the queen and Solomon had a romantic relationship that produced a son named Menelik I, who would become the founder of the Ethiopian imperial dynasty. The story goes that when Menelik came of age, he visited his father in Jerusalem, and Solomon, being the wise king he was, gave his son a replica of the Ark of the Covenant. However, Menelik's companions, being either very clever or very mischievous, switched the replica for the real Ark. Thus, according to Ethiopian tradition, the true Ark of the Covenant has been resting in Ethiopia for the past 3,000 years, specifically in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. Now, whether you believe this story or not, and it's worth noting that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church guards this claim with the kind of secrecy that would make intelligence agencies jealous, it illustrates something important about Ethiopian identity. This is a nation that has always seen itself as chosen, as special, as connected to the divine in ways that set it apart from its neighbors. It's a confidence that would serve them well in the centuries to come, especially when faced with challenges that would have broken lesser nations. The Aksumite kingdom reached its zenith around the 6th century CE, when King Caleb launched a military expedition across the Red Sea to Yemen to protect persecuted Christians there. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a demonstration of Axum's power and reach. The Axumites conquered Yemen and installed a Christian king, showing that they could project power across the seas when necessary. It was the kind of bold move that announced to the world that Axum was not just a regional power, but a player on the international stage. But like all great kingdoms, Axum eventually faced challenges that tested its resilience. The rise of Islam in the 7th century changed the dynamics of Red Sea trade, as Muslim merchants began to dominate the routes that had made Axum wealthy. Additionally, climate change. Yes, climate change was affecting civilizations long before SUVs were invented, led to a decline in agricultural productivity. The great kingdom that had once stood as an equal to Rome began to turn inward, focusing more on the highlands and less on maritime trade. This inward turn marked the beginning of what historians call the Dark Ages of Ethiopian history. Though calling any period of Ethiopian history truly dark is a bit like calling a sunset dim. There's always something glowing somewhere. During this period, from roughly the 7th to the 11th centuries, Ethiopia became more isolated from the outside world, but this isolation allowed for the development of a uniquely Ethiopian Christian culture that would become one of the most distinctive in the world. It was during this time that Ethiopian Christianity began to develop its characteristic features. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, while maintaining connections to the broader Christian world, evolved its own traditions, its own calendar, and its own way of understanding the faith. Ethiopian monks began carving churches directly out of solid rock, creating architectural marvels that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. These rock-hewn churches, particularly those at Lalibela, represent one of humanity's most extraordinary architectural achievements. Imagine deciding that instead of building a church on top of the ground like a normal person, you're going to carve one out of solid volcanic rock, complete with intricate details, hidden perfect acoustics. It's the kind of project that would make modern engineers reach for their calculators, and then quietly suggest maybe building a nice wooden church instead. The most famous of these rock-hewn churches is the Church of St. George at Lalibela, carved in the shape of a perfect Greek cross and descending deep into the earth. Legend has it that angels came down at night to continue the work that human hands had begun during the day, which is either a beautiful expression of faith or the world's first recorded case of outsourcing construction work to celestial contractors. Either way, the result is breathtaking. A church that seems to grow out of the earth itself, as if the very rock had been convinced to take on sacred form. But Ethiopia's isolation was not destined to last forever. In the 12th century, a new dynasty emerged that would reshape the kingdom and reconnect it with the wider world. The Zagu dynasty, which ruled from roughly 1137 to 1270 CE, represented a shift in Ethiopian power from the northern regions around Aksum to the central highlands. The Zagu kings were great builders and patrons of the church, and it was under their rule that many of Ethiopia's most famous rock-hewn churches were created. The most famous of the Zag rulers was King Lalibela, who gave his name to the town that houses Ethiopia's most spectacular collection of rock-hewn churches. Lalibela had a vision, literally according to tradition, of creating a new Jerusalem in the Ethiopian highlands. This wasn't just religious enthusiasm. It was a practical response to the fact that Muslim control of the Holy Land made pilgrimage to Jerusalem difficult for Ethiopian Christians. So Lalibela decided to bring Jerusalem to Ethiopia, complete with churches named after their Holy Land counterparts and a river renamed the Jordan. The construction of Lalibela's churches was an undertaking that would challenge even modern engineering capabilities. Each church was carved from a single piece of volcanic rock, working from the top down, with craftsmen carefully removing stone to create walls, pillars, windows, and intricate decorative details. The precision required was extraordinary. One mistake could ruin years of work. It's the kind of project that would have medieval health and safety inspectors reaching for their clipboards and shaking their heads in disbelief. The Zagwaid also saw the flourishing of Ethiopian art and literature. Ethiopian scribes developed a distinctive style of manuscript illumination that combined Christian themes with local artistic traditions. These manuscripts, written on parchment made from goat or sheep skin, were decorated with vibrant colors and intricate geometric patterns that reflected both the sophistication of Ethiopian artistic culture and the deep religious devotion of its creators. The scribes who created these works were not just copying texts. They were creating works of art that were meant to inspire and educate, to bring the divine word to life through visual beauty. But the Zagu dynasty's time was limited. In 1270 CE, they were overthrown by a new dynasty that claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, the Solomonic dynasty. This wasn't just a change of rulers. It was a restoration, at least according to the new dynasty's propaganda department. The Solomonic emperors claimed that the Zagu had been usurpers, and that they were restoring the rightful line of Ethiopian kings that stretched back to Menelik I, son of Solomon and Sheba. The founder of the restored Solomonic dynasty was Yakuno Amlak, whose name means, "Let the Lord rise," which is either a statement of religious devotion or the ancient equivalent of a campaign slogan. Yakuno Amlak established his capital in the central highlands and began the process of expanding Ethiopian control over the surrounding regions. This expansion wasn't just about conquest. It was about creating a unified Christian kingdom that could stand as a beacon of faith in a region increasingly dominated by Muslim powers. Under the Solomonic dynasty, Ethiopia entered what many historians consider its golden age. The kingdom expanded its borders, developed a sophisticated administrative system, and became a major player in regional politics. Ethiopian armies marched south into the lands of the Oromo and Sidama peoples, east toward the Somali coast, and west into the Sudan borderlands. This expansion brought new peoples, new cultures, and new challenges into the Ethiopian fold, creating a diverse empire that was held together by a combination of military might, administrative skill, and religious devotion. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval Ethiopia was its religious tolerance, at least by the standards of the time. While the empire was officially Christian, and the emperor was considered the defender of the faith, Ethiopian rulers generally allowed their Muslim and traditional religious subjects to practice their beliefs freely as long as they paid their taxes and didn't rebel. This pragmatic approach to religious diversity was partly born of necessity. Ruling a diverse empire required a certain amount of flexibility, but it also reflected a confidence in Ethiopian Christianity that didn't feel threatened by the presence of other faiths. The Ethiopian church during this period developed some unique characteristics that set it apart from other Christian traditions. Ethiopian Christianity incorporated elements of Jewish law and practice, including dietary restrictions, circumcision, and Sabbath observance on Saturday as well as Sunday. This wasn't syncretism for its own sake. It reflected the Ethiopian church's understanding of itself as the heir to ancient Israel, the keeper of the Ark of the Covenant, and the true continuation of biblical tradition. Ethiopian Christians saw themselves not as converts to a foreign religion, but as the inheritors of the oldest and purest form of the faith. The 14th and 15th centuries marked the height of Ethiopian power and influence. Under emperors like Amdicion I and Zara Yacob, the Ethiopian Empire became a major regional power that commanded respect from its neighbors and attracted attention from distant lands. Ethiopian merchants traded with India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world, bringing back not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched Ethiopian civilization. It was during this period that Ethiopia first came to the attention of medieval Europe, though the initial contact was based more on wishful thinking than accurate information. European Christians, hard-pressed by Muslim expansion in the Mediterranean and the Holy Land, began to hear rumors of a great Christian kingdom somewhere in Africa or Asia, ruled by a mysterious figure known as Prester John. This legendary Christian king was said to rule over a vast empire filled with wonders, rivers of gold, fountains of youth, and armies of fantastic creatures ready to march to the aid of their European co-religionists. The reality, as usual, was more complex than the legend. Ethiopia was indeed a Christian kingdom, and it was indeed powerful, but it was also dealing with its own challenges and had its own priorities. When Portuguese explorers finally made contact with Ethiopia in the early 16th century, they found not the mythical kingdom of Prester John, but a sophisticated African civilization with its own rich traditions, its own understanding of Christianity, and its own ideas about how to deal with the wider world. The Portuguese arrival in Ethiopia coincided with one of the most challenging periods in Ethiopian history. In the early 16th century, the Ethiopian Empire faced a massive invasion from the Sultanate of Adil, led by a charismatic and ruthless leader known as Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, or Gran the Left-Handed. This wasn't just another border skirmish. It was an existential threat to Ethiopian civilization. Ahmad Gran's forces, equipped with firearms obtained from the Ottoman Empire and motivated by religious fervor, swept through the Ethiopian highlands like a wildfire, destroying churches, burning manuscripts, and forcing mass conversions to Islam. The Ethiopian response to this crisis revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their civilization. Emperor Lebna Dengel, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the invasion, was forced to flee from his capital and conduct a guerrilla war from the mountains. For over a decade, Ethiopia teetered on the brink of collapse as Gran's forces controlled most of the empire's territory. It was during this dark period that the Ethiopians made a fateful decision that would have long-lasting consequences. They appealed to the Portuguese for military assistance. The Portuguese response was swift and decisive. A small force of 400 Portuguese musketeers, led by Cristóvão da Gama, son of the famous explorer Vasco da Gama, landed on the Ethiopian coast and marched inland to join the Ethiopian resistance. The arrival of Portuguese firearms and military expertise helped tip the balance of the war, though not without cost. Cristóvão da Gama was captured and executed by Ahmad Gran, but his sacrifice galvanized both Portuguese and Ethiopian forces. In 1543, at the Battle of Wainadaga, Ahmad Gran was killed by a Portuguese musket ball, and his army collapsed. The defeat of Ahmad Gran saved Ethiopian independence, but it also marked the beginning of a new and complicated relationship with European powers. The Portuguese, having helped save Ethiopia, naturally expected some gratitude and influence in return. They brought with them not just military assistance, but also Jesuit missionaries who were determined to bring the Ethiopian Orthodox Church into communion with Rome. This led to one of the most turbulent periods in Ethiopian religious history, as successive emperors struggled to balance their gratitude to the Portuguese with their commitment to Ethiopian Orthodox traditions. Emperor Susenyos, who ruled from 1607 to 1632, made the fateful decision to convert to Catholicism and declare it the official religion of Ethiopia. This wasn't just a personal religious choice. It was a political earthquake that shook Ethiopian society to its foundations. The emperor's conversion sparked widespread rebellion as Ethiopian nobles, clergy, and common people alike rejected what they saw as foreign interference in their ancient faith. The country descended into civil war, with brother fighting brother and communities torn apart by religious conflict. The situation became so dire that Susenyos, on his deathbed, reportedly told his son and heir, "I have finished the kingdom. You restore it." It was perhaps the most honest assessment any ruler has ever made of their own reign's impact. His son, Fasilides, took this advice to heart and immediately reversed his father's religious policies, expelling the Jesuit missionaries and restoring Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity as the state religion. The Portuguese, who had once been welcomed as saviors, suddenly found themselves persona non grata in the land they had helped preserve. Fasilides didn't stop at religious restoration. He also implemented a policy of isolation that would define Ethiopia for the next 2 centuries. Foreigners were banned from entering the country, and Ethiopians were forbidden from traveling abroad. It was as if the entire empire had decided to pull up the drawbridge and wait for the world to become a more reasonable place. This isolation wasn't born of xenophobia, but of hard-earned wisdom about the complications that came with foreign entanglements. The Ethiopians had learned that accepting help from Europeans was a bit like inviting a vampire into your house. Once you let them in, it became very difficult to get them to leave. During this period of isolation, Haile established a new capital at Gondar, in the northern highlands. Gondar would serve as the Ethiopian capital for over 2 centuries, and under Haile and his successors, it became one of Africa's most magnificent cities. The emperors of Gondar built a series of castles and palaces that combined Ethiopian architectural traditions with influences absorbed from their brief contact with European and Middle Eastern cultures. These structures, with their distinctive round towers and crenellated walls, created a skyline that was uniquely Ethiopian, neither purely African nor European, but something entirely its own. The Gondorian period, as historians call it, was marked by a flowering of Ethiopian culture and learning. The isolation that kept foreigners out also allowed Ethiopian traditions to develop without external interference. Ethiopian artists perfected their distinctive style of religious painting, creating works that combined Byzantine influences with local artistic traditions to produce something that was unmistakably Ethiopian. Ethiopian scholars compiled and preserved ancient texts, ensuring that the literary heritage of their civilization would survive for future generations. But perhaps most importantly, the Gondorian period saw the development of what we might call the Ethiopian national character, a blend of pride, independence, religious devotion, and stubborn resistance to outside interference that would serve the country well in the challenges to come. The Ethiopians of this period developed a saying that roughly translates to "Ethiopia stretches her hands unto God," reflecting their belief that their nation enjoyed divine protection and had a special role to play in God's plan for the world. The Gondorian emperors also had to deal with the ongoing challenge of governing a diverse empire. Ethiopia was never a homogeneous nation. It was a collection of different peoples, languages, and cultures held together by a combination of imperial authority, religious unity, and shared traditions. The Oromo people, who had been migrating into Ethiopian territory since the 16th century, represented a particular challenge. The Oromo were not conquered subjects, but rather a dynamic people who gradually integrated into Ethiopian society while maintaining their own cultural identity. This integration wasn't always smooth. There were conflicts and tensions, but over time, the Oromo became an integral part of Ethiopian civilization, contributing their own traditions, military skills, and political systems to the imperial structure. The 18th century brought new challenges to the Ethiopian Empire. The long period of isolation had preserved Ethiopian independence, but it had also left the country somewhat behind in terms of military technology and administrative efficiency. More importantly, the empire began to fragment as regional nobles gained increasing autonomy from the central government. This period, known as the Era of the Princes, or Zemin Mezifind, saw the Ethiopian Empire effectively dissolve into a collection of competing principalities, each ruled by a powerful noble who paid lip service to the emperor in Gondar, but acted as an independent ruler in his own territory. The era of the princes wasn't necessarily a dark age. Many regions prospered under local rule, and Ethiopian culture continued to flourish. But it did represent a significant weakening of central authority. The emperor became little more than a figurehead, maintained in his palace at Gondar, but wielding no real power beyond the city walls. It was during this period that the famous saying arose, "He reigns but does not rule," referring to the powerless emperors who maintained the forms of imperial authority while real power lay in the hands of regional strongmen. This fragmentation might have continued indefinitely, leaving Ethiopia as a collection of small kingdoms rather than a unified empire. But the 19th century brought new. external pressures that would force the country to reunify or face conquest by foreign powers. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 made the Red Sea region strategically important to European powers, and the scramble for Africa was beginning in earnest. Ethiopia's neighbors were falling under European control one by one. Egypt to the British, Sudan to the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, and the Somali coast to various European powers. It was becoming clear that Ethiopia would need to modernize and reunify quickly or risk losing its independence entirely. The man who would lead Ethiopia's reunification was Haile, better known to history as Emperor Tewodros II. Tewodros was not born to rule. He was the son of a minor noble from western Ethiopia, but he possessed the kind of charismatic leadership and military genius that occasionally appears to reshape history. Through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer force of personality, Tewodros managed to defeat the various regional princes and reunify Ethiopia under his rule by 1855. Tewodros was a modernizer who understood that Ethiopia needed to change if it was going to survive in the modern world. He attempted to create a professional army equipped with modern weapons, tried to reform the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to reduce its political power, and sought to establish diplomatic relations with European powers on terms of equality. His vision was of an Ethiopia that could stand as an equal among the nations of the world, neither isolated nor subordinated, but engaged with the wider world on its own terms. Unfortunately, Tewodros's modernization efforts were hampered by the very fragmentation he was trying to overcome. His reforms threatened the traditional power structures that had governed Ethiopia for centuries, creating resistance among both nobles and clergy. His attempts to create a modern army required resources that the fragmented empire could barely provide, and his efforts to establish diplomatic relations with Europe led to a series of misunderstandings that would ultimately prove fatal to his reign. The most famous of these misunderstandings involved a letter that Tewodros sent to Queen Victoria of Britain in 1862, seeking to establish diplomatic relations and requesting British assistance in modernizing Ethiopia. When the British government failed to respond to his letter, apparently it got lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, which must be the most expensive case of lost mail in history. Tewodros took it as a personal insult. In retaliation, he imprisoned several British subjects, including the British consul. What followed was a comedy of errors that escalated into a full-scale military expedition. The British government, faced with public pressure to rescue their imprisoned subjects, decided to launch a military expedition to Ethiopia. This wasn't just any military expedition. It was one of the most expensive and logistically complex operations in British military history. The British assembled a force of over 13,000 men, along with elephants, camels, and enough supplies to sustain a small city, and marched inland from the Red Sea coast toward Tewodros's mountain fortress at Nagdala. Tewodros, faced with this overwhelming force, found himself increasingly isolated. Many of his own nobles, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned him or actively collaborated with the British. As the British force approached Magdala, Tewodros realized that his situation was hopeless. Rather than surrender and face the humiliation of capture, he chose to end his life on his own terms. On April 13, 1868, as British forces stormed his fortress, Tewodros shot himself with a pistol that had been given to him as a gift by Queen Victoria. A final irony in a story full of tragic misunderstandings. The British, having achieved their objective of rescuing their imprisoned subjects, withdrew from Ethiopia without attempting to establish colonial control. This restraint wasn't born of altruism, but of practical considerations. The expedition had been enormously expensive, and the British had no desire to get bogged down in the Ethiopian highlands. They took with them a vast collection of Ethiopian manuscripts and artifacts, including the crown of Tewodros, which ended up in British museums where they remain to this day. much to the ongoing frustration of Ethiopian governments. The death of Tewodros left Ethiopia once again fragmented, but his example had shown that reunification was possible. The next emperor to attempt this task was Johannes IV, who managed to establish his authority over most of northern and central Ethiopia by the 1870s. Johannes was a different kind of ruler than Tewodros, more traditional in his approach, more willing to work within existing power structures, and more focused on defending Ethiopia against external threats than on internal modernization. And external threats there were in abundance. The opening of the Suez Canal had made the Red Sea region a focus of European imperial competition, and Ethiopia found itself surrounded by expanding colonial powers. The Egyptians, backed by the British, were expanding southward from Sudan. The Italians had established a colony in Eritrea and were looking to expand inland. The French had established a foothold in Djibouti, and various other European powers were sniffing around the region, looking for opportunities to establish their own colonial territories. Johannes proved to be a skilled military leader who successfully defended Ethiopia against multiple invasions. He defeated Egyptian forces at the Battle of Gundit in 1875, and again at Gora in 1876, demonstrating that Ethiopian forces could hold their own against modern armies when fighting on their home ground. These victories were important, not just militarily, but psychologically. They showed that European and Egyptian forces were not invincible, and that Ethiopian independence could be maintained through military resistance. But Johannes's greatest challenge came from an unexpected direction. In the 1880s, a religious leader named Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi, the Guided One, in Sudan, and launched a revolt against Egyptian rule. The Mahdist movement quickly gained momentum, and by 1885, Mahdist forces had captured Khartoum and established control over most of Sudan. This created a new and dangerous neighbor for Ethiopia, a militant Islamic state that viewed the Christian Ethiopian Empire as a natural enemy. The conflict between Ethiopia and the Mahdist state was both a religious war and a struggle for regional dominance. Mahdist forces launched repeated raids into Ethiopian territory, capturing slaves and livestock and spreading their religious message. Johannes was forced to divert resources from other challenges to defend his western borders against these incursions. In 1889, he personally led an army against a major Mahdist invasion, and at the Battle of Metema, he was killed while leading a charge against enemy positions. The death of Johannes in battle created another succession crisis, but this time the outcome would be different. The man who emerged victorious from the struggle for the throne was Sahol Mariam, who took the throne named Menelik II. Menelik had been king of Shua, one of the southern provinces of Ethiopia, and he brought to the imperial throne a different perspective and a different set of priorities than his predecessors. Menelik II would prove to be one of the most important rulers in Ethiopian history, and indeed in African history. He was a modernizer like Tewodros, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the importance of working within existing systems rather than trying to overthrow them entirely. He was a military leader like Johannes, but he also understood that diplomacy could be as important as warfare in defending Ethiopian independence. Most importantly, he was a unifier who managed to bring together the diverse peoples of Ethiopia into a more cohesive empire than had existed for centuries. When Menelik came to the throne in 1889, Ethiopia was still a fragmented collection of semi-autonomous provinces held together by personal loyalty to the emperor and shared religious traditions. By the time of his death in 1913, he had created a modern centralized state with defined borders, a professional army, and the infrastructure necessary to function as a unified nation. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't accomplished without conflict, but it was one of the most remarkable state-building achievements in African history. Menelik's first priority was to complete the reunification of Ethiopia that had been begun by Tawadros and continued by Johannes. This meant bringing the various regional nobles under central control, but it also meant expanding Ethiopian territory to include regions that had never been fully integrated into the empire. Menelik's armies marched south and east, incorporating the lands of the Oromo, Sidama, Voraj, and other peoples into the Ethiopian Empire. This expansion was sometimes accomplished through negotiation and alliance, but more often it required military conquest. The expansion under Menelik roughly doubled the size of the Ethiopian Empire, creating the territorial boundaries that modern Ethiopia still largely maintains today. This expansion brought new peoples, new cultures, and new resources into the Ethiopian fold, but it also created new challenges. The newly incorporated territories had their own traditions, their own languages, and their own ways of organizing society. Integrating these diverse regions into a unified state required a delicate balance of accommodation and assimilation that would challenge Ethiopian rulers for generations to come. But Menelik's most famous achievement was his successful defense of Ethiopian independence against Italian colonial ambitions. The Italians had established a colony in Eritrea in the 1880s and were looking for opportunities to expand their African empire. They saw Ethiopia as a natural target, a relatively weak African state that could be conquered and added to their colonial possessions. In 1889, they signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Menelik, which they believed gave them a protectorate over Ethiopia. Menelik, however, had a different understanding of the treaty's terms, and when the Italians began acting as if Ethiopia were their protectorate, he repudiated the treaty and prepared for war. The resulting conflict, known as the First Italo-Ethiopian War, would become one of the most significant events in African history. The Italians, confident in their superior technology and military organization, invaded Ethiopia in 1895 with an army of about 17,000 men, including both Italian troops and Eritrean colonial forces. They expected to face the kind of disorganized resistance that European forces had encountered elsewhere in Africa, and they anticipated a quick and easy victory. What they encountered instead was a unified Ethiopian response that caught them completely off guard. Menelik had spent years preparing for this conflict, importing modern weapons, training his army, and building alliances with regional leaders throughout Ethiopia. When the Italian invasion began, he was able to mobilize an army of over 100,000 men, the largest indigenous army that had ever been assembled in Africa. This wasn't just a collection of tribal warriors. It was a disciplined force equipped with modern rifles and artillery, led by experienced commanders who understood both traditional Ethiopian military tactics and modern warfare. The climax of the war came at the Battle of Adwa on March 1, 1896. The Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, had divided his forces into 3 columns and attempted a complex flanking maneuver against the Ethiopian positions. Unfortunately for the Italians, their maps were inaccurate, their communications broke down, and their columns became separated and vulnerable to Ethiopian attack. Menelik, commanding from the center of the Ethiopian line, was able to concentrate his forces against each Italian column in turn, achieving local superiority despite being outnumbered overall. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Italian forces. Over 7,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers were killed, and thousands more were captured. General Baratieri himself barely escaped with his life. The Ethiopian victory was so complete that it effectively ended Italian ambitions in Ethiopia for the next 40 years. More importantly, it demonstrated to the world that African armies could defeat European forces when properly organized and equipped. The Battle of Adwa had implications that extended far beyond Ethiopia's borders. It was the first time since the ancient world that an African army had decisively defeated a European colonial force, and it sent shockwaves throughout both Africa and Europe. For Africans, it proved that European military superiority was not absolute, and it inspired resistance movements throughout the continent. For Europeans, it forced a recognition that Africa contained sophisticated societies capable of defending themselves against colonial conquest. The victory at Adwa also secured Ethiopia's position as the only African nation, along with Liberia, to maintain its independence during the scramble for Africa. This independence wasn't just symbolic. It had practical implications that would shape Ethiopia's development for decades to come. While other African societies were being disrupted by colonial rule, Ethiopia was able to continue developing according to its own priorities and traditions. While other African economies were being restructured to serve colonial interests, Ethiopia maintained control over its own resources and trade relationships. Menelik used the breathing space provided by his victory at Adwa to continue his modernization efforts. He established Ethiopia's first modern schools, built the country's first hospitals, and began construction of a railway line from the coast to the capital. He also moved the capital from Gondar to Addis Ababa, a new city that he founded in the Central Highlands. The name Addis Ababa means new flower in Amharic, and it was intended to symbolize the renewal and modernization of the Ethiopian Empire. The choice of location was strategic. Addis Ababa was centrally located within the expanded empire, making it easier to govern the diverse territories that Menelik had brought under Ethiopian control. The establishment of Addis Ababa as the new capital was more than just an administrative decision. It was a statement about the kind of country Menelik wanted Ethiopia to become. Unlike Gondar, which was steeped in medieval traditions and dominated by ancient palaces, Addis Ababa was designed from the ground up as a modern city. It had wide boulevards suitable for automobiles, modern buildings constructed with imported materials, and infrastructure designed to support a growing population and expanding economy. Menelik also understood that modernization required more than just new buildings and technology. It required new ideas and new ways of thinking. He sent Ethiopian students abroad to study in European universities, bringing back knowledge of modern science, medicine, and administration. He invited foreign advisors to help establish modern institutions, but unlike his predecessors, he was careful to maintain Ethiopian control over these relationships. The foreigners who came to Ethiopia during Menelik's reign came as employees and advisors, not as colonial administrators or missionaries seeking to transform Ethiopian society. One of Menelik's most important innovations was the establishment of a modern postal system and telegraph network. This might seem like a minor administrative detail, but in a country as large and diverse as Ethiopia, communication was crucial for maintaining unity and central control. The ability to send messages quickly across the empire allowed Menelik to coordinate military operations, respond to local crises, and maintain contact with regional governors. It also facilitated trade and commerce, allowing merchants to coordinate their activities across vast distances. The telegraph system also connected Ethiopia to the wider world in ways that had been impossible during the period of isolation. Ethiopian officials could now communicate directly with their counterparts in other countries, facilitating diplomatic relations and trade agreements. News from around the world could reach Addis Ababa within days rather than months, allowing Ethiopian leaders to stay informed about international developments that might affect their country. But perhaps Menelik's most lasting contribution to Ethiopian development was his establishment of a modern educational system. Traditional Ethiopian education had been dominated by the Orthodox Church, which provided excellent training in religious subjects, but limited exposure to modern science and technology. Menelik established secular schools that taught mathematics, science, geography, and modern languages alongside traditional subjects. He also sent promising students abroad for advanced education, creating a cadre of Ethiopian intellectuals who could contribute to the country's modernization. The establishment of modern schools wasn't just about practical skills. It was about creating a new kind of Ethiopian identity. Students in Menelik's schools learned about Ethiopian history and culture, but they also learned about the wider world and Ethiopia's place in it. They studied the great civilizations of the past and the modern nations of the present, developing a sense of pride in Ethiopian achievements while also understanding the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. Menelik's reign also saw significant economic development. The emperor encouraged the development of new industries, the expansion of trade, and the improvement of agricultural techniques. He established the first modern banks in Ethiopia, facilitating commerce and investment. He also began the construction of roads and bridges, improving transportation and communication throughout the empire. The famous railway line from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, begun during Menelik's reign, was a particular source of pride. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever undertaken in Africa, and it dramatically reduced the time and cost of transporting goods between the Ethiopian highlands and the sea. The railway project was not without its controversies and complications. The construction was financed by French investors and built by French engineers, leading to concerns about foreign influence in Ethiopian affairs. There were also technical challenges. The line had to cross difficult terrain, including deep gorges and high mountain passes. Construction was slow and expensive, and there were frequent disputes between the Ethiopian government, the French company, and various international creditors. At one point, the project nearly collapsed entirely due to financial difficulties. But Menelik persevered with the railway project because he understood its strategic importance. The railway would give Ethiopia reliable access to the sea, reducing the country's dependence on potentially hostile neighbors for trade. It would also facilitate the movement of troops and supplies, strengthening the central government's ability to maintain control over distant provinces. Most importantly, it would demonstrate to the world that Ethiopia was a modern nation capable of undertaking major infrastructure projects. The completion of the railway to Addis Ababa in 1917, 4 years after Menelik's death, marked a symbolic end to Ethiopia's isolation and the beginning of its full engagement with the modern world. Ethiopian goods could now reach international markets quickly and efficiently, while foreign products and ideas could flow into Ethiopia more easily than ever before. The railway station in Addis Ababa became a symbol of Ethiopian modernity and progress, a concrete demonstration that this ancient African empire could adapt and thrive in the 20th century. But Menelik's modernization efforts were not without their critics and challenges. Traditional nobles worried that centralization would reduce their power and autonomy. Religious leaders feared that secular education and foreign influences would undermine Ethiopian Orthodox traditions. Regional peoples who had been incorporated into the empire through conquest sometimes resented the imposition of central authority and Amharic culture. Managing these tensions required all of Menelik's considerable political skills. One of the most significant challenges Menelik faced was the question of succession. The emperor had no surviving male heirs, and Ethiopian tradition was ambiguous about female succession. This created uncertainty about the future of the dynasty and the continuity of Menelik's modernization policies. The emperor eventually designated his grandson, Li-Asu, as his heir, but this choice would prove to be problematic. Li-Asu, who came to power in 1913 after Menelik's death, was a young man with ideas that differed significantly from those of his grandfather. Where Menelik had been cautious about foreign influences while embracing modernization, Iyasu seemed more willing to experiment with radical changes. Most controversially, he began to show sympathy for Islam and to cultivate relationships with Muslim leaders, both within Ethiopia and in neighboring countries. This was seen as a betrayal of Ethiopian Christian traditions and created alarm among the nobility and clergy. The situation was complicated by the outbreak of World War I, which created new pressures and opportunities for Ethiopia. The war pitted the European colonial powers against each other, potentially creating opportunities for Ethiopia to expand its influence or recover territories that had been lost to colonial expansion. But it also created risks. Choosing the wrong side in the conflict could have disastrous consequences for Ethiopian independence. Iyasu's apparent sympathy for the Ottoman Empire and the Central Powers, combined with his religious policies, created a crisis of confidence in his leadership. In 1916, a coalition of nobles, clergy, and military leaders deposed him in a coup and installed Menelik's daughter Zudi Chu as empress. This was a remarkable development. Ethiopia became one of the first countries in the world to have a female head of state in the modern era. However, real power was exercised by the regent Ras Tafari Makonnen, who would later become Emperor Haile Selassie. The regency of Ras Tafari marked the beginning of a new phase in Ethiopian history. Tafari was a modernizer in the tradition of Menelik II, but he was also more internationally minded and more willing to engage with the wider world. He understood that Ethiopia's continued independence would require not just military strength, but also diplomatic skill and international recognition. He set about establishing Ethiopia as a respected member of the international community, seeking membership in international organizations and building relationships with major world powers. One of Tafari's first major diplomatic initiatives was to secure Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations in 1923. This was a significant achievement. Ethiopia became the first African country to join the League, and its membership was a recognition of its status as a sovereign nation. The admission wasn't without controversy. Some European members questioned whether an African country could be considered truly civilized enough for membership. But Tafari's diplomatic skills and Ethiopia's demonstrated ability to govern itself effectively won the day. Ethiopia's membership in the League of Nations was more than just a symbolic achievement. It provided the country with a forum for international diplomacy and a potential source of support in case of external threats. Tafari understood that in an increasingly interconnected world, isolation was no longer a viable strategy for maintaining independence. Ethiopia needed to be part of the international system if it was going to protect itself against future challenges. Tafari also continued Menelik's modernization efforts, but with an even greater emphasis on international engagement. He traveled extensively, becoming the first Ethiopian ruler to visit Europe and other parts of the world. These travels weren't just diplomatic missions. They were learning opportunities. Tafari studied modern institutions, technologies, and practices, bringing back ideas that could be adapted to Ethiopian conditions. The regent's travels also served an important public relations function. By appearing in international forums as an articulate, educated, and sophisticated leader, Tafari challenged European stereotypes about African rulers and demonstrated that Ethiopia was a modern nation, deserving of respect and recognition. His appearances at international conferences and his meetings with world leaders helped to establish Ethiopia's reputation as a significant player in international affairs. In 1930, following the death of Empress Zudi Chu, Ras Tafari was crowned as Emperor Haile Selassie I. The coronation was a spectacular affair that attracted international attention and demonstrated Ethiopia's wealth, sophistication, and cultural richness. Representatives from around the world attended the ceremony, which was conducted according to ancient Ethiopian traditions, but also incorporated modern elements that reflected the country's engagement with the contemporary world. The name Haile Selassie means power of the Trinity, reflecting the new emperor's deep religious faith and his understanding of his role as the defender of Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. But Haile Selassie was also a modernizer who understood that tradition and progress could coexist. His coronation ceremony included both ancient rituals that connected him to the long line of Ethiopian emperors and modern elements that demonstrated Ethiopia's place in the contemporary world. Haile Selassie's early years as emperor were marked by continued efforts at modernization and international engagement. He promulgated Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931, establishing a framework for modern government while preserving the essential features of the imperial system. The constitution created a parliament, established basic rights for citizens, and provided for a modern legal system, but it also maintained the emperor's central role in Ethiopian governance. The new constitution was a careful balance between tradition and modernity. It recognized the emperor as the supreme authority in Ethiopia, maintaining the traditional basis of Ethiopian government, but it also established institutions and procedures that reflected modern principles of governance. The parliament, while limited in its powers, provided a forum for discussion of national issues and a mechanism for incorporating diverse voices into the political process. Haile Selassie also continued the expansion of modern education, establishing new schools and sending more students abroad for advanced training. He understood that Ethiopia's long-term development would depend on having an educated population capable of managing modern institutions and technologies. The emperor himself was a strong advocate for education, often visiting schools and encouraging students to pursue their studies diligently. But the most significant challenge of Haile Selassie's early reign came from an unexpected source: the return of Italian colonial ambitions. Benito Mussolini, who had come to power in Italy in 1922, was determined to restore Italian prestige and build a new Roman empire. The humiliating defeat at Adwa in 1896 still rankled in Italian memory, and Mussolini saw the conquest of Ethiopia as a way to avenge that defeat and demonstrate Italian military prowess. The Italian preparations for a new invasion of Ethiopia began in the early 1930s. Mussolini built up Italian forces in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, the two colonies that bordered Ethiopia, and began stockpiling weapons and supplies for a major military campaign. The Italians also began a propaganda campaign designed to justify their planned invasion, portraying Ethiopia as a barbaric and uncivilized country that needed to be brought under European control for its own good. Haile Selassie was well aware of Italian preparations and did his best to prepare Ethiopia for the coming conflict. He attempted to modernize the Ethiopian military, importing weapons and training officers in modern military techniques. He also sought international support, appealing to the League of Nations and other world powers to help defend Ethiopian independence. Unfortunately, the international response was lukewarm at best. Most European powers were more concerned with the growing threat from Nazi Germany than with Italian ambitions in Africa. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War began in October 1935 when Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from both Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. This time, the Italians were better prepared than they had been in 1896. They had a larger army, better equipment, and more sophisticated logistics. Most importantly, they had air power. Italian aircraft could bomb Ethiopian positions and supply lines, giving the invaders a significant advantage over the defending forces. The Ethiopian response was hampered by several factors that had not been present during the first Italian invasion. The country was less unified than it had been under Menelik II, with some regional leaders remaining neutral or even collaborating with the Italians. The Ethiopian military, while larger than it had been in 1896, was still not fully modernized and lacked the air power and heavy weapons that the Italians possessed. Most critically, Ethiopia was fighting alone. Unlike in 1896, when the country had been able to import weapons freely, the League of Nations had imposed an arms embargo that affected Ethiopia more than Italy. Despite these disadvantages, Ethiopian forces put up fierce resistance to the Italian invasion. The mountainous terrain of Ethiopia favored the defenders, and Ethiopian soldiers fought with the same courage and determination that had won the victory at Adwa. For several months, the outcome of the war remained in doubt, with Ethiopian forces achieving some notable successes against Italian columns. However, the Italian use of poison gas, in violation of international law, began to tip the balance of the war. Italian aircraft dropped mustard gas on Ethiopian positions, causing horrific casualties and demoralizing Ethiopian forces. The use of chemical weapons was particularly effective against Ethiopian cavalry and traditional warriors who lacked protective equipment. International protests against the use of poison gas were largely ineffective, and the Italians continued to employ these weapons throughout the campaign. By early 1936, it became clear that Ethiopian resistance was collapsing. Italian forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and Ethiopian armies were being defeated in detail. In May 1936, Italian forces entered Addis Ababa, and Mussolini proclaimed the establishment of Italian East Africa, combining Ethiopia with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland into a single colonial territory. Haile Selassie, faced with the collapse of organized resistance, made the difficult decision to go into exile rather than continue a hopeless struggle. On May 2, 1936, he left Ethiopia and eventually made his way to Britain, where he would spend the next 5 years working to restore Ethiopian independence. His departure was controversial. Some Ethiopians felt that the emperor should have remained to lead continued resistance. But Haile Selassie understood that his presence outside Ethiopia might be more valuable than his capture or death inside the country. The emperor's appearance before the League of Nations in Geneva in June 1936 became one of the most memorable moments in the organization's history. Speaking in Amharic, with his words translated into French and English, Haile Selassie delivered a passionate plea for international action to restore Ethiopian independence. His speech was repeatedly interrupted by Italian journalists and fascist sympathizers, but the emperor maintained his dignity and continued his appeal for justice. I, Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, am here today to claim that justice which is due to my people, and the assistance promised to it 8 months ago, when 50 nations asserted that aggression had been committed in violation of international treaties, the emperor declared. His words resonated around the world, and his dignified bearing in the face of fascist harassment made him a symbol of resistance to aggression and a champion of international law. But the League of Nations, despite its fine words about collective security and international law, proved unable or unwilling to take effective action to restore Ethiopian independence. Economic sanctions against Italy were half-hearted and ineffective, and no military action was taken to reverse the Italian conquest. The failure of the League to defend Ethiopia was one of the factors that led to its eventual collapse and replacement by the United Nations after World War II. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia itself, Italian rule proved to be harsh and exploitative. The Italians attempted to transform Ethiopia into a typical colonial territory, exploiting its resources for the benefit of the metropolitan power and imposing European cultural and political systems on the Ethiopian people. They built roads and other infrastructure, but primarily to facilitate the extraction of Ethiopian wealth rather than to benefit the local population. Italian colonial rule also attempted to destroy Ethiopian cultural and political institutions. The Italians banned the use of Amharic in schools and government, promoted Italian language and culture, and attempted to undermine the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. They also implemented racial laws similar to those in Nazi Germany, creating a hierarchy that placed Italians at the top, mixed-race individuals in the middle, and Ethiopians at the bottom. However, Italian rule in Ethiopia was never fully consolidated. Resistance continued throughout the period of occupation, with Ethiopian patriots conducting guerrilla warfare against Italian forces and their collaborators. This resistance was particularly strong in the mountainous regions of the country, where traditional Ethiopian military tactics were most effective against conventional forces. The resistance was led by a variety of figures, including traditional nobles who had remained loyal to Haile Selassie, religious leaders who opposed Italian attempts to undermine Ethiopian Christianity, and local commanders who organized their communities for continued struggle against the occupiers. One of the most famous resistance leaders was Ababi Arigai, who organized guerrilla operations in the Shua region and became known as the Lion of Judah's Defender. Another was Balkasafo, an elderly general who had served under Menelik II and refused to accept Italian rule despite his advanced age. The resistance wasn't just military. It was also cultural and spiritual. Ethiopian priests continued to conduct services in hidden locations, preserving religious traditions that the Italians were trying to suppress. Ethiopian teachers secretly taught children in Amharic, maintaining the language and literature that were central to Ethiopian identity. Ethiopian artists and musicians created works that celebrated Ethiopian history and culture while subtly mocking Italian pretensions. The Italian occupation also faced practical challenges that made effective control difficult. Ethiopia was a large country with difficult terrain and poor communications, making it hard for Italian forces to maintain control over remote areas. The Italian colonial administration was understaffed and underfunded, relying heavily on local collaborators who were often unreliable. Most importantly, the Italians never succeeded in winning the hearts and minds of the Ethiopian people, who continued to view them as foreign invaders rather than legitimate rulers. The situation began to change dramatically with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Initially, Italy's entry into the war on the side of Nazi Germany seemed to strengthen the Italian position in East Africa, as it gave Mussolini's forces the opportunity to attack British territories in Sudan and Kenya. Italian forces achieved some early successes, capturing British Somaliland and advancing into Sudan and Kenya. However, the British response was swift and decisive. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Red Sea region and the threat that Italian East Africa posed to British communications with India and the Far East, the British assembled a substantial force to reconquer the region. More importantly for Ethiopia, the British recognized Haile Selassie as the legitimate ruler of Ethiopia and agreed to support his restoration to the throne. In January 1941, Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia as part of a British military expedition aimed at liberating the country from Italian rule. The emperor's return was both symbolic and practical. It provided a rallying point for Ethiopian resistance and demonstrated British commitment to restoring Ethiopian independence. The sight of their emperor back on Ethiopian soil after 5 years of exile galvanized Ethiopian patriots and led to a massive uprising against Italian rule. The liberation campaign was remarkably swift and successful. British and Commonwealth forces, supported by Ethiopian patriots and Free French troops from Djibouti, advanced on multiple fronts against Italian positions. The Italians, cut off from reinforcements and facing hostile populations throughout their territory, were unable to mount effective resistance. By April 1941, British forces had captured Addis Ababa, and Italian resistance in Ethiopia had largely collapsed. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after he had left the country, Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa in triumph. The date was carefully chosen. It was the anniversary of the Italian occupation of the capital, and the emperor's return on this date symbolized the complete reversal of Italian conquest. Crowds lined the streets to welcome their returning emperor, and the celebration continued for days. The restoration of Ethiopian independence was more than just a military victory. It was a vindication of the principles of international law and collective security that had been so badly damaged by the League of Nations' failure to defend Ethiopia in 1935-36. Ethiopia became the first country occupied by the Axis powers to be completely liberated, and Haile Selassie became a symbol of resistance to fascist aggression. However, the liberation of Ethiopia also created new challenges and complications. The country had been devastated by 5 years of war and occupation, with much of its infrastructure destroyed and its economy disrupted. The Italian colonial administration had left behind a complex legacy of roads and buildings, but also of social disruption and cultural damage. Most importantly, the experience of occupation and resistance had changed Ethiopian society in ways that would have long-lasting implications. The war had also strengthened the position of regional leaders and resistance commanders who had fought against the Italians. These men had gained military experience, political influence, and popular support during the occupation, and they expected to be rewarded for their loyalty and service. Managing these expectations while restoring central authority would be one of Haile Selassie's greatest challenges in the post-war period. The emperor also had to deal with the changed international situation created by World War II. The old European colonial empires were beginning to crumble, and new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were emerging to dominate world affairs. Ethiopia needed to navigate this new international environment while maintaining its independence and pursuing its development goals. Haile Selassie proved to be remarkably adept at international diplomacy in the post-war world. He aligned Ethiopia with the Western allies, while maintaining cordial relations with the Soviet Union and other communist countries. He was one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945, and Ethiopia became an active participant in international organizations and conferences. The emperor understood that in the New World Order, small countries needed to work together to protect their interests against the superpowers. One of Haile Selassie's most important international initiatives was his role in the creation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. The emperor had long been an advocate for African unity and independence, and he saw the OAU as a way to promote these goals while also enhancing Ethiopia's influence in continental affairs. The decision to locate the OAU headquarters in Addis Ababa was a recognition of Ethiopia's unique position as the only African country, along with Liberia, that had maintained its independence throughout the colonial period. The emperor's famous speech to the United Nations General Assembly in 1963 became one of the most memorable addresses in the organization's history. That until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war, he declared, his words resonating far beyond the halls of the UN building in New York. The speech would later inspire Bob Marley's song, War, bringing Haile Selassie's message to a global audience and cementing his status as an icon of resistance to oppression and inequality. But while Haile Selassie was gaining international acclaim as a statesman and advocate for African independence, the situation within Ethiopia was becoming increasingly complex. The emperor's modernization efforts, which had been interrupted by the Italian occupation, resumed with renewed vigor after the liberation. New schools were built, hospitals were established, and infrastructure projects were launched. The emperor also began to implement land reforms and administrative changes designed to modernize Ethiopian society and government. However, these reforms created tensions within Ethiopian society. Traditional nobles worried that modernization would undermine their power and privileges. Regional leaders who had gained influence during the resistance period resented attempts to reassert central control. Younger, educated Ethiopians became impatient with the pace of change and began to question whether the imperial system was capable of delivering the rapid development that the country needed. The 1960 coup attempt marked a turning point in Haile Selassie's reign and in Ethiopian history more broadly. While the emperor was on a state visit to Brazil, a group of military officers and intellectuals, led by the commander of the Imperial Guard, attempted to overthrow the government and install the emperor's son, Crown Prince Asfaw Wasson, as a constitutional monarch. The coup leaders proclaimed their intention to modernize Ethiopia more rapidly and to reduce the power of traditional elites. The coup attempt failed after 4 days of fighting in Addis Ababa, but it revealed the depth of dissatisfaction with the pace of reform and the growing influence of educated, modernizing elements within Ethiopian society. The emperor's response was characteristically measured. He pardoned most of the coup participants and actually accelerated some of his reform programs. But the incident also made him more cautious about political change and more suspicious of potential challenges to his authority. The 1960s and early 1970s saw continued economic and social development in Ethiopia, but also growing political tensions. The emperor established new universities, expanded the educational system, and promoted industrial development. Ethiopia became a regional leader in aviation, with Ethiopian Airlines becoming one of Africa's most successful carriers. The country also became a major coffee exporter, with Ethiopian coffee gaining recognition in international markets for its quality and distinctive flavor. But these achievements were overshadowed by growing problems that the imperial government seemed unable or unwilling to address effectively. Land tenure remained a major issue, with most Ethiopian peasants still working as tenant farmers on land owned by nobles or the church. Urban unemployment was rising as young people moved to cities in search of opportunities that often didn't exist. Regional inequalities were growing, with some areas benefiting from development programs while others remained marginalized. The most serious challenge came from the northern province of Eritrea, which had been federated with Ethiopia in 1952 under a UN arrangement. The federation was supposed to give Eritrea autonomy while maintaining its connection to Ethiopia, but Haile Selassie gradually eroded Eritrean autonomy and in 1962 formally annexed the territory as an Ethiopian province. This led to the emergence of an armed independence movement that would plague Ethiopia for the next 3 decades. The Eritrean independence struggle was particularly challenging for the imperial government because it combined several different sources of opposition. There were ethnic and linguistic differences between Eritreans and other Ethiopians, religious differences between the largely Muslim Eritrean lowlands and the Christian Ethiopian highlands, and political differences over the degree of autonomy that Eritrea should enjoy within the Ethiopian state. The emperor's response to the Eritrean challenge was primarily military, with Ethiopian forces attempting to suppress the independence movement through force. This approach was largely unsuccessful and actually strengthened Eritrean nationalism by creating martyrs and demonstrating the imperial government's unwillingness to address Eritrean grievances through political means. The conflict also drained resources that could have been used for development and created a climate of militarization that would have long-term consequences for Ethiopian politics. By the early 1970s, it was becoming clear that the imperial system was facing a crisis of legitimacy. The emperor, now in his 80s, was increasingly seen as out of touch with the needs and aspirations of younger Ethiopians. The government's response to a devastating famine in the northern provinces in 1973-74 was widely criticized as inadequate and insensitive. International media coverage of the famine, which showed starving peasants while the imperial court continued to live in luxury, created a powerful image of a government that had lost touch with its people. The final crisis began in early 1974 with a series of strikes and demonstrations by various groups: students, teachers, taxi drivers, and eventually military units. What started as protests over specific grievances gradually evolved into a broader challenge to the imperial system itself. The emperor's attempts to defuse the crisis through concessions and reforms came too late and were seen as signs of weakness rather than genuine change. The military committee that eventually took power, known as the Derg, meaning committee in Amharic, initially claimed to be acting in support of the emperor and the monarchy. However, it quickly became clear that the military had its own agenda for transforming Ethiopian society. In September 1974, Haile Selassie was deposed and placed under house arrest. The man who had ruled Ethiopia for over 4 decades, who had become an international symbol of African dignity and independence, was removed from power by a group of junior military officers who claimed to represent the Ethiopian people's desire for change. The fall of Haile Selassie marked the end of one of the world's oldest monarchies and the beginning of a new and turbulent chapter in Ethiopian history. The Solomonic dynasty, which had claimed to rule Ethiopia for over 700 years and traced its lineage back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, came to an abrupt end. The emperor himself died in custody in 1975 under circumstances that remain controversial to this day. The Derg, led initially by General Amen Andom and later by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, promised to modernize Ethiopia and address the social and economic problems that had plagued the imperial system. They proclaimed a socialist revolution, nationalized land and major industries, and launched ambitious programs to transform Ethiopian society. The new government also adopted a more aggressive approach to the Eritrean conflict and other regional challenges. However, the military government's rule proved to be even more authoritarian and repressive than the imperial system it had replaced. The Derg eliminated political opposition through a campaign of terror known as the Red Terror, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of Ethiopians. The government's socialist policies, while well-intentioned, often proved to be economically disastrous and contributed to further famines and economic decline. The military government also faced new challenges that the imperial system had not encountered. The Cold War created opportunities for external intervention, with the Soviet Union and Cuba providing military support to the Derg, while the United States supported various opposition groups. Regional conflicts intensified, with not only Eritrea, but also other provinces experiencing armed rebellions against central authority. The 1980s brought new disasters to Ethiopia, including a massive famine that attracted international attention and prompted a global relief effort. The images of starving children that appeared on television screens around the world created a new international image of Ethiopia, no longer the proud, independent African nation that had defeated European colonialism, but a country synonymous with poverty, famine, and suffering. The military government's response to the famine was widely criticized as inadequate and politically motivated. The Derg was accused of using food aid as a weapon against rebellious regions and of prioritizing military spending over famine relief. International relief efforts, while saving many lives, also highlighted the government's failures and contributed to growing opposition to military rule. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the military government was losing control of the situation. Multiple armed opposition groups were operating throughout the country. The economy was in shambles, and the government's international support was declining as the Cold War came to an end. The Soviet Union, facing its own internal problems, began to reduce its support for the Derg, leaving the military government increasingly isolated. The end came swiftly in 1991, when a coalition of opposition groups, led by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, captured Addis Ababa and forced Mengistu Haile Mariam to flee the country. The fall of the military government marked the end of 17 years of socialist rule and the beginning of another new chapter in Ethiopian history. The EPRDF, led by Meles Zenawi, promised to establish a democratic, federal system that would address the ethnic and regional tensions that had plagued Ethiopia for decades. The new government adopted a constitution that recognized the right of ethnic groups to self-determination, including the right to secession. This was a radical departure from previous Ethiopian governments, which had emphasized national unity and centralized control. One of the new government's first major decisions was to allow Eritrea to hold a referendum on independence. In 1993, Eritreans voted overwhelmingly for independence, and Eritrea became a separate nation after 30 years of armed struggle. This was a painful loss for many Ethiopians, who had long considered Eritrea an integral part of their country, but it also removed a major source of conflict and allowed both countries to focus on their own development. The 1990s and 2000s saw significant economic growth and development in Ethiopia under EPRDF rule. The government implemented market-oriented economic reforms while maintaining a strong role for the state in development planning. Infrastructure projects were launched, including new roads, dams, and telecommunication systems. The education system was expanded dramatically, with new universities established and primary education made more widely available. Ethiopia also began to play a more active role in regional and international affairs. The country became a major contributor to African Union peacekeeping operations and hosted important international conferences. Ethiopian troops participated in peacekeeping missions in Sudan, Somalia, and other conflict zones, demonstrating the country's commitment to regional stability. However, the EPRDF government also faced criticism for its authoritarian tendencies and restrictions on political opposition. While elections were held regularly, opposition parties complained of harassment and unfair treatment. Press freedom was limited, and civil society organizations faced restrictions on their activities. These issues created tensions with international donors and human rights organizations. The government's development strategy, while successful in achieving economic growth, also created new challenges. Rapid population growth put pressure on land and natural resources. Urbanization created new social problems as people moved from rural areas to cities in search of opportunities. Environmental degradation became a growing concern as forests were cleared for agriculture and industrial development. In 2012, Haile Selassie died unexpectedly, creating a leadership transition within the EPRDF. His successor, Haile Selassie, continued many of the same policies, but faced growing challenges from ethnic tensions, political opposition, and economic pressures. Protests began to emerge in various parts of the country, particularly in the Oromia and Amhara regions, reflecting dissatisfaction with government policies and demands for greater political participation. The protests intensified in 2015 and 2016, leading to declarations of emergency rule and violent crackdowns by security forces. The government's response to the protests was widely criticized by international observers and created a crisis of legitimacy similar to what had faced previous Ethiopian governments. In 2018, facing mounting pressure, Haile Selassie resigned as prime minister. The selection of Abiy Ahmed as the new prime minister in 2018 marked another turning point in Ethiopian history. Abiy, who was young, charismatic, and from the Oromo ethnic group, promised sweeping reforms to address the country's political and social challenges. He released political prisoners, allowed exiled opposition groups to return, and began to liberalize the political system. Abiy's most dramatic early achievement was the resolution of the long-standing conflict with Eritrea. In 2018, he traveled to Eritrea and signed a peace agreement with President Isaias Afwerki, formally ending the state of war that had existed between the two countries since their border conflict in 1998-2000. This achievement earned Abiy the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, making him the first Ethiopian to receive this honor. However, Abiy's reforms also unleashed forces that proved difficult to control. The loosening of political restrictions led to increased ethnic tensions and conflicts in various parts of the country. Long-suppressed grievances came to the surface, and some groups began to make territorial and political demands that challenged the federal system. The government struggled to maintain order while also promoting democratic reforms. The situation became particularly complex in the northern Tigray region, where the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which had been the dominant force within the EPRDF, felt marginalized by Abiy's reforms. Tensions between the federal government and the Tigray regional government escalated throughout 2019 and 2020, eventually leading to armed conflict in late 2020. The conflict in Tigray represented a new challenge for Ethiopia, a civil war that threatened to tear apart the federal system and potentially lead to the country's fragmentation. The fighting involved not only Ethiopian federal forces and Tigray regional forces, but also Eritrean troops and militia groups from neighboring regions. The humanitarian consequences were severe, with thousands of people killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. As Ethiopia entered the 2020s, it faced challenges that were both familiar and new. The country was still grappling with the fundamental questions that had faced it throughout its long history. How to balance unity and diversity, how to modernize while preserving valuable traditions, how to maintain independence while engaging with the wider world. But these eternal challenges were now complicated by new factors: rapid population growth, climate change, technological disruption, and the changing dynamics of international relations. The story of Ethiopia is far from over. This ancient land, which has survived the rise and fall of empires, the challenges of colonialism, the disruptions of revolution and war, continues to evolve and adapt. The Ethiopian people, who have shown remarkable resilience throughout their long history, continue to work toward a future that honors their past while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow. What makes Ethiopia's story so compelling is not just its longevity, though few civilizations can claim such continuity over such a long period, but its consistent themes of independence, adaptation, and resilience. From the ancient kingdom of Axum to the modern federal republic, Ethiopians have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to absorb new influences while maintaining their essential identity, to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their core values, and to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through determination and ingenuity. The Ethiopia of today is vastly different from the Ethiopia of Axum, or even the Ethiopia of Haile Selassie, but certain characteristics remain constant. A pride in independence that led the Axumites to build their trading empire, that inspired Menelik II to defeat the Italians at Adwa, and that motivated the resistance fighters during the Italian occupation, continues to shape Ethiopian attitudes toward the world. The religious devotion that led to the carving of the rock churches at Lalibela, and that sustained Ethiopian identity through centuries of challenges, continues to play an important role in Ethiopian society. The cultural creativity that produced distinctive art, literature, and music continues to flourish and evolve. Perhaps most importantly, the Ethiopian commitment to finding their own path, neither completely isolated from the world nor completely absorbed by it, continues to guide the country's development. Ethiopia has always been a place where different cultures, religions, and traditions have coexisted and influenced each other, creating something unique and valuable. This tradition of synthesis and adaptation may be Ethiopia's greatest strength as it faces the challenges of the 21st century. The coffee that Ethiopia gave to the world serves as a perfect metaphor for the country's contribution to human civilization. Like the coffee plant itself, Ethiopian culture has deep roots that have allowed it to survive droughts and storms, to adapt to different conditions, and to produce something that enriches the lives of people around the world. The Ethiopian story is not just the story of one country. It is part of the larger human story of how societies develop, adapt, and endure. As we sit by our fire, perhaps with that cup of Ethiopian coffee, and reflect on this long journey through Ethiopian history, we can appreciate both the uniqueness of the Ethiopian experience and its universal themes. Every society faces the challenge of balancing tradition and change, of maintaining identity while adapting to new circumstances, of preserving independence while engaging with the wider world. Ethiopia's long experience with these challenges offers lessons and inspiration for all of humanity. The story of Ethiopia reminds us that history is not just about dates and battles and the rise and fall of rulers, though all of these play their part. It is about the enduring human capacity to create meaning, to build communities, to preserve what is valuable from the past while working toward a better future. It is about the remarkable ability of human societies to survive and thrive despite facing challenges that might seem overwhelming. In the end, the story of the Ethiopian Empire is a story of hope. Hope that independence can be maintained, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Hope that different peoples can live together in peace and mutual respect. Hope that ancient wisdom and modern knowledge can be combined to create something better than either could achieve alone. It is a story that reminds us that the human spirit, like the highland coffee plant, has deep roots and remarkable resilience, capable of producing something beautiful and nourishing, even in the most challenging conditions. As the sun sets over the Ethiopian highlands, casting long shadows across the ancient landscape where this remarkable civilization has flourished for over 3 millennia, we can reflect on the extraordinary journey we have taken together through the corridors of time. From the towering obelisks of Axum to the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, from the castles of Gondar to the modern buildings of Addis Ababa, from the victory at Adwa to the challenges of the present day, Ethiopia's story continues to unfold. The eternal flame of Ethiopian civilization burns on, sometimes flickering in the winds of change, sometimes blazing brightly in moments of triumph, but never extinguished. It is a flame that has been tended by countless generations of Ethiopians who understood that they were the guardians of something precious and unique, a civilization that belonged fully to Africa, while also being part of the wider human family. The highlands where our story began still echo with the footsteps of ancient kings and queens, still resonate with the prayers of countless pilgrims, still witness the daily struggles and triumphs of ordinary people trying to build better lives for themselves and their children. The morning mist still dances over the mountains, carrying with it the dreams and aspirations of a people who have never forgotten that they are the inheritors of one of humanity's oldest and most remarkable civilizations. In the markets of Addis Ababa, where merchants from across Africa and beyond come to trade, the spirit of ancient Axum lives on. In the schools and universities, where young Ethiopians study everything from traditional literature to modern technology, the educational vision of emperors like Menelik II and Haile Selassie continues to bear fruit. In the churches where believers gather to worship, according to traditions that stretch back over 1,600 years, the faith that sustained Ethiopia through its darkest hours continues to provide strength and guidance. But Ethiopia's story is not just about preserving the past. It is also about creating the future. The young Ethiopians who are starting businesses, creating art, developing new technologies, and working to solve their country's challenges are writing new chapters in this ancient story. They carry with them the wisdom of their ancestors, the knowledge that independence must be earned and defended, that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division, that adaptation and resilience are the keys to survival and prosperity. The challenges facing modern Ethiopia are real and significant. Rapid population growth, environmental degradation, ethnic tensions, and economic inequality all require urgent attention and creative solutions. But these challenges are not fundamentally different from those that Ethiopia has faced throughout its long history. The kingdom of Axum had to adapt to changing trade routes and new competitors. The medieval emperors had to balance the demands of different regions and peoples. Menelik, too, had to modernize his country while preserving its independence. Haile Selassie had to navigate the complexities of the modern international system while maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty. Each generation of Ethiopians has found ways to meet the challenges of their time while preserving what was most valuable from their heritage. The current generation will undoubtedly do the same, drawing on the deep wells of wisdom, creativity, and resilience that have sustained Ethiopian civilization for over 3 millennia. The international community, too, has much to learn from Ethiopia's long experience. In an era when many societies are struggling with questions of identity, diversity, and globalization, Ethiopia's example of maintaining cultural distinctiveness while engaging with the wider world offers valuable insights. The country's success in preserving its independence during the colonial period demonstrates that it is possible for smaller nations to maintain their sovereignty even when facing overwhelming odds, provided they have the will, the wisdom, and the unity to do so. Ethiopia's religious traditions, which have managed to maintain their distinctiveness while remaining part of the broader Christian family, offer lessons about how faith communities can preserve their unique characteristics while participating in global religious dialogue. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's synthesis of Christian theology with local traditions and practices shows how universal religious truths can be expressed through particular cultural forms without losing their essential meaning. The country's artistic and literary traditions, which have continuously evolved while maintaining their distinctive Ethiopian character, demonstrate how cultures can remain vibrant and relevant by embracing change while honoring their roots. Ethiopian music, art, and literature continue to influence and be influenced by global trends while retaining their unmistakably Ethiopian identity. Perhaps most importantly, Ethiopia's story reminds us that history is not predetermined, that societies have choices about how they respond to challenges and opportunities. The Ethiopians who chose to resist Italian colonialism at Adwa could have chosen submission. The resistance fighters who continued to oppose the Italian occupation could have chosen collaboration. The leaders who chose to modernize their country while preserving its independence could have chosen isolation or complete westernization. At each crucial moment in Ethiopian history, individuals and communities made choices that shaped not only their own destinies, but also the destiny of their nation and, in some cases, the wider world. The victory at Adwa inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa and Asia. Haile Selassie's advocacy for international law and collective security helped shape the post-World War II international order. Ethiopia's role in founding the Organization of African Unity contributed to the continent's decolonization and development. These achievements were not inevitable. They were the result of conscious choices made by people who understood that they had the power to shape their own future. This understanding, that history is made by human choices rather than by impersonal forces, is perhaps Ethiopia's greatest gift to the world. It is a reminder that we are not passive victims of circumstances, but active agents in creating the world we want to live in. As we conclude our journey through Ethiopian history, we might reflect on what this ancient civilization can teach us about the art of living well in a complex and challenging world. Ethiopia's experience suggests that it is possible to honor the past while embracing the future, to maintain one's identity while engaging with others, to preserve what is valuable while changing what needs to be changed. The Ethiopian approach to these challenges has not always been perfect. No human society ever is. But it has been remarkably successful over the long term. The fact that Ethiopian civilization has survived and thrived for over 3 millennia, adapting to countless changes while maintaining its essential character, is testimony to the wisdom of this approach. The coffee ceremony that remains central to Ethiopian social life offers a perfect metaphor for this wisdom. The ceremony takes time. It cannot be rushed. It brings people together in a spirit of community and mutual respect. It honors tradition while allowing for individual expression and creativity. It transforms simple ingredients, coffee beans, water, fire, into something that nourishes both body and spirit. It creates a space for conversation, reflection, and connection. Like the coffee ceremony, Ethiopian civilization has always understood that the most important things in life cannot be rushed. That community is more valuable than individual achievement. That tradition and innovation can work together. That simple elements can be transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. And that taking time to connect with others is essential for human flourishing. These insights, born from thousands of years of experience in the Ethiopian highlands, are as relevant today as they were in the time of the Queen of Sheba or the builders of Lalibela. In our fast-paced, interconnected, often fragmented modern world, Ethiopia's example of patient persistence, community solidarity, creative adaptation, and spiritual grounding offers a different model of how to live and thrive. The story of Ethiopia, is ultimately a story about the triumph of the human spirit over adversity, about the power of communities to preserve what they value most while adapting to changing circumstances, about the possibility of maintaining one's identity and independence while engaging constructively with the wider world. It is a story that offers hope and inspiration to all who hear it, regardless of their own background or circumstances. As the stars appear over the Ethiopian highlands, as they have for countless generations, they shine down on a land that has given the world coffee, ancient wisdom, artistic beauty, and an example of how to maintain dignity and independence in the face of overwhelming challenges. They shine down on a people who have never forgotten that they are the guardians of something precious and unique, something that belongs not just to them, but to all humanity. The eternal flame of Ethiopian civilization continues to burn, tended by new generations who understand both the weight of their inheritance and the possibilities of their future. It is a flame that illuminates not just the Ethiopian highlands, but the entire human journey, reminding us all that, with courage, wisdom, and persistence, it is possible to create something beautiful and enduring in this world. And so our story ends where it began, with the gentle lapping of waves against distant shores, with the morning mist dancing over ancient mountains, with the aroma of coffee beans carrying promises of new beginnings. The story of Ethiopia is far from over. Indeed, its most important chapters may yet be written. But the foundation has been laid by thousands of years of human experience, creativity, and resilience. Whatever challenges and opportunities the future may bring, the people of Ethiopia will meet them as their ancestors did, with pride in their heritage, confidence in their abilities, and hope for their children's future. The coffee is finished, the fire is burning low, but the story continues. Somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands, a child is being born who will carry this ancient civilization into the future. Somewhere, a student is learning about the glorious past and dreaming of contributing to an even more glorious future. Somewhere, an artist is creating something new that honors the old. Somewhere, a farmer is planting seeds that will feed the next generation. Somewhere, a family is gathering for the evening meal, sharing stories and dreams, continuing the eternal human conversation that has sustained Ethiopian civilization for over 3 millennia. This is the true meaning of the Ethiopian story, not just the tale of kings and battles, of victories and defeats, of rise and fall, but the ongoing story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of communities preserving what they value while adapting to change, of a civilization that has learned how to endure and thrive across the centuries. It is a story that belongs to Ethiopia, but it also belongs to all of us, for it is part of the larger human story of how we create meaning, build communities, and pass on our values to future generations. In the end, the story of the Ethiopian Empire is not just history, it is prophecy, a vision of what human societies can achieve when they combine respect for the past with openness to the future, when they balance individual achievement with community solidarity, when they maintain their distinctive identity while engaging constructively with the wider world. It is a story that reminds us that the human journey is far from over, that there are still new chapters to be written, new challenges to be met, new possibilities to be explored. The eternal flame burns on, and the story continues.